me, I think there were two important things going on in the movie, which may or may not have been obvious to you, but I think there's two completely different groups of students that were being talked about here. The poor and elites. There were lots of teachers and kids from East Oakland. I'm not too familiar with the geography of San Francisco, but I think from what I saw there, that there's lots of poor kids who've been put under immense pressure in schools like that. And then lots of it was about elites. And I want to make two different comments about those two different groups. With the poor, you could argue that this is an attempt, this regime they're being placed under is some attempt to put pressure onto their supposedly underperforming schools. To put pressure on them with a testing regime so that they can up their standards, etc., etc. Whether that works or not is another story, because there are two major factors probably which influence educational outcomes. One is the socioeconomic status of the child's background, SES. It's a famous concept in the sociology of education, and it was mentioned in the movie. The other is factors much closer to the teacher, and that's also mentioned in the movie. As far as the socioeconomic status background of those kids are concerned, Aristotle has a lot of interesting things to say about this when he says, as far as justice is concerned, you have to treat equals equally and unequals unequally. So those kids in the poor schools need a heck of a lot more than the state's probably giving to them in order for them to succeed. And so what's probably happening in terms of the testing regimes in their school is that they simply become modes to exit those students earlier from the education system in order to service more menial positions in the economy, if you like. And so I think a heck of a lot more has to go on in those schools to support those students and to support those teachers. And those comments were well made in the movie, at least I picked them up, before you're going to see success, however it's defined, for those kids. As far as the elites are concerned, and I want to concentrate my comments a bit more here, I want to draw quickly on a French social theorist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu, who says that what we're talking about here is cultural capital. It's a metaphor that's taken from financial capital, which is currency, which is money that we trade in. And he says we're actually trading all the time in this game that we're playing, on this field that we're playing, in something called cultural capital. And it comes down to our, if you like, fundamental insecurities as individuals, because we're never quite as sure of ourselves or as confident of ourselves as we like to pretend to others that we are. And so we seek the icons of status in order to gain that recognition from those around us. And so we spend a large portion of our lives chasing after this cultural capital. Whether it's embedded in Harvard, and I've heard somebody raising questions, why do you want to go to Harvard? It was you who said that, Leslie. Whether it's embodied in a Mercedes-Benz, whether it's embodied in a Gucci handbag, these are the icons or the symbols which we go chasing after in order, argues Bourdieu, to help us feel more confident about ourselves and to try to win that status recognition from peers in our community. And of course, it inevitably becomes, and somebody's made this comment, it inevitably becomes an unwinnable arms race. Because that's the point of having a fashion trend, is that it's out of fashion next year. So you've got to buy another Gucci handbag next year, or a new model Mercedes-Benz next year. Harvard doesn't go out of fashion quickly, fortunately. And that kind of, well, not ancient, but historical capital associated with the well-established universities certainly holds good currency. But I suppose I want to say one thing about that, and that is that as you realize that a lot of these icons are absolutely hollow, spending fortunes on a Gucci handbag is probably a laughable enterprise to lots of us. And one almost pities the person who wanders around for being the schmuck who's actually spent all their money on that. And I suppose I can say that universities and these so-called league tables and these best colleges in the US, the US News and World Report was featured, they're pretty hollow too. And I can give you one example here in Hong Kong. I used to be at the Faculty of Education in Hong Kong for 10 years. I'm at the Institute of Education now for the last couple of years. I know from who's been hired there that there is far more intellectual gravity amongst the professoriate at the Institute of Education out in Tai Po than there is in the Faculty of Education at Hong Kong U and at Chinese U combined. If you want to get the best degree in education right now, it's at the Institute of Education. But there is not the historical cachet associated with it. And so, because I have all the mates at Hong Kong U and I'll go there after this since I'm in Prof to say hi, I know that they're getting stronger applicants for their master's degrees than we are, because historically, that's the capital that counts. But if you really want the best degree, it's somewhere else. It's not here. The second point I wanted to say about the so-called rankings of these colleges and so on. There are a number of factors that go into the calculation of those rankings, whether it's done by US News or whether it's the Times Higher Education Supplement or so on. And we're involved in putting them together. And what they do, Times Higher or whatever, is to jig the weighting they give to the different factors. Some are so-called objective factors and some are academics' impressions of other universities. And they might more heavily weight this in order to produce a ranking that says Harvard and Oxford and the London School of Economics and so on. So I think we need to treat the holiness of those rankings with a little bit less holiness, to treat them with the same skepticism as we do Mercedes-Benz and Prada. That is, if we are skeptical about Mercedes-Benz and Prada. I also think that discussion then leads on to that really important question at the back about values, about what we think is important for our children, because what Bourdieu says about cultural capital and this endless arms race to accumulate these false gods is ultimately something that we're putting pressure on our children to do as well, for ourselves, I suppose, and for them. So I want to infuse a little bit of skepticism into the debate about these things we're supposedly chasing after, and rather to turn to your comment about values and say, surely it's more about the really simple things that we all know to be true, the things which are far more important, like our happiness as individuals, our happiness in our families, in our relationships, in our communities, and the things that you saw going up on the screen there, like get more sleep. I'm not sure if you noticed that. Kids, what can you do? Sleep more. And we know this is true in Hong Kong. When I was at Hong Kong U, I used to ride the bus from downtown to campus at 7:15 in the morning, and there were kids who were 6 years or 7 years old asleep on the bus. Eric, when I was that age and you were that age, you were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at 7:15 in the morning. These kids have been up past midnight at 6 or 7 years of age. So we know the story of what goes on in Hong Kong. And I think it's really about going back to those really simple things that we know to be important and placing more emphasis there. But at the same time, we have to accept, and I was talking to Malcolm earlier, that there is this reality in which we exist. So it's a little bit silly to say, yes, let's just focus on these kinds of things and forget all about that, and we're going to be skeptical about that, and who cares about that, when actually they do count. And I think there is a balance that we are able to find at home in trying to manage those two. And I do have some comments about that, but I'm not sure whether I should stop there, Eric.
Let's get some response.
And get some response, and maybe come back to that in a minute.
That'd be helpful. Thanks, Mark.